Assistant Secretary of State Richard Murphy, Operation Earnest Will has begun. That's the escort of Kuwaiti oil tankers by the United States and the reflagging of those tankers. If you would, take a minute and outline some of the short-term goals and some of the longer-term foreign policy goals of this operation.
Short-term goals of reflagging are not really short-term. They're to assure the safe transit from outside of the Strait of Hormuz, the entrance to the Persian Gulf, up to the port of Kuwait, where they will take on oil for delivery on international routes. I say that's short-term, yes. We want each transit to be safe, but it's long-term because it depends on the end of the war when we will be able to wind up that mission.
Are there some longer-term foreign policy goals for the region that benefit the United States from this operation?
Oh, definitely. Our long-term goals in the region, strategic, economic, political, are, in a word, keep our access to the oil of the Gulf area vital to our interests, vital to the free world, assure the safety and stability of those states, most of which are producer states, and with several of which we've had several decades of close relations. And beyond that, it's to get this war ended as quickly as possible.
Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. We're live from our studios in Washington on this Wednesday evening. Our topic this evening is the Middle East. We hope you will join in with questions or comments for our special guest, Richard Murphy, who is Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs. Long history of service in the State Department, has served as ambassador to 4 countries over his tenure at the State Department, and he will be in our studios to answer your telephone calls. We'll be going to our lines in just a few minutes for your questions and comments. We're going to be talking a bit about the reflagging of Kuwaiti oil tankers, but also about some of the implications of that policy for U.S. relations in that region of the world. Please join in with your comments. Let me ask a bit about why now. The war has been going on for a long time. Why have we implemented this policy at this point?
We were asked last December by Kuwait to consider accepting under American registry some of their tankers. They had come under strong attack by Iran beginning in September, and there was a cycle of attacks which has continued ever since last September, focusing on trade associated with Kuwait. They didn't have to be Kuwaiti flags, but they were ships going to serve the port of Kuwait. This was an attack by Iranian, from Iran, an attack designed to break the unity of the Gulf Council. Those are the 6 states of the Gulf Council, which Kuwait is the most vulnerable in a sense because it's closest to Iraq and closest to Iran. They wanted to stop Iraq from being supportive of they wanted to stop Kuwait from being supportive of Iraq, and to send a signal to the other states that, look, this Gulf is Iran's Gulf, and you better pay attention to our role and our leadership in the Gulf and follow our way of doing things. And we just don't go along with that.
How much danger is there involved for U.S. military personnel?
I'm not sure there's a major danger for U.S. military personnel in the Gulf. There was that tragic accident of the USS Stark in May. It was an accidental hit curiously by the Iraqis. Curiously, I say, because I returned from a trip to the Gulf that same afternoon that it was hit, and when I first heard the news, I assumed it was a long-expected attack on one of our ships from Iran. Turned out to be not. It was this awful accident committed by the Iraqi Air Force. But naval procedures have been tightened up. They're on a state of alert, of high alert. Their mission is one that has been there, establishing a presence in the Gulf for the past 40 years. Our Navy, and it's called Middle East Force, has been present in the Gulf ever since the late 40s. So danger there always is for our military. They join up expecting a challenge and a danger. They happen to have a very vital mission to perform for our country in the Gulf. We think that the risks of attack on our ships and on the ships we escort, however, is relatively low.
A Harvard professor who is a critic of the policy writes in New Republic magazine this week that he sees the reflagging as an attempt to back into a position of support for Iraq by the United States in this long-going war.
policy was, is, and is going to stay one of neutrality between Iraq and Iran. What we're supporting is freedom of navigation. What we're supporting is free access to the oil supplies of the Gulf. What we're supporting is an end to the war. Now, we are at odds with Iran. We wish we weren't on such bad terms with Iran. Maybe one of these days relations can improve. But as long as Iran pursues its present policies, that's unlikely. Keeping the war going, sponsoring terrorism around the region, there's just no meeting of minds between us and Tehran. But this doesn't mean, as we work to end the war and as we work to deny arms to Iran, that we're taking the sides of Iraq.
Secretary Murphy, we have a caller on the line. I'm going to take that first call, and then I want to come back to you for a minute and talk a bit about another news story this week, and that's the United Nations resolution on the ceasefire.
Very important part of the policy.
Let's take our first question. It's from Fairless Hills, Pennsylvania. You're on the air, caller.
Yes, I'd like to know if any of the oil that we're protecting is going to Europe, and if so, why can't we persuade the Europeans to hold up their end to secure this oil?
Thanks for the call.
Yes, Europe is depending on Gulf oil are originating in the Gulf states for about 30% of its consumption. Now, you ask why we can't persuade Europe. We don't have to persuade Europe. You've had the British fleet in the Gulf for the past several years. Today, they've committed 3 warships, a mix of frigates and destroyers. 3 warships out of a total British Navy of 60 warships. That is a considerably higher proportion of the British Navy committed to supporting freedom of navigation and protection of British flagships in the Gulf than we have. The French, just in the last day, announced that they would be protecting French flagships. They've had a French fleet in the northern Arabian Sea, again, ever since the Second World War. And they're spending about 10 days a month. 2 ships from that French flotilla are in the Gulf. So Europe doesn't have to be persuaded. It recognizes its vital interests are in the Gulf just as ours are.
As we mentioned, the United Nations on Monday of this week passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire in the Iran-Iraq war. First, explain to us what kind of an effect that might have. And secondly, press reports were calling it a victory for the United States there. Do you agree with that?
What's unusual about the resolution was that this is the first time in United Nations history that they have demanded, the Security Council has demanded a ceasefire that wasn't pre-cooked. They've called for ceasefires in the Arab-Israeli War, 1967. They called again in 1973. Both times it was understood that Israel and the Arab states at war were going to accept it. There was no such understanding with the Iranian side when the Council just 2 days ago passed that resolution. It has several parts to it. The first is a comprehensive ceasefire. There's a call for exchange of prisoners of war. There's a call for withdrawal to international boundaries, respecting the territorial integrity of both Iraq and Iran. So the role that the UN has taken on was the role that, in a sense, we've always hoped for from the UN. The five permanent members, US, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, agreed on the resolution, and then they worked with the non-permanent members of the Council, and they persuaded them, and they accepted some amendments and some changes in the text, but then the Council met as a body and voted 15-0, all in favor of that resolution. It was a very exciting experience. I was up there on Monday in New York. Was there U.S. leadership? Indeed there was. We were pushing for that resolution for the past 6 months. A number of the other members of the Council kind of lost interest in it after the siege around Basra, which had caught a lot of attention in January. The Iranian attack on that southern Iraqi city of Basra, as that began to fade, the interest in the Council began to fade in getting a new Security Council resolution. But we worked it, we brought it back, and of course at the end it's a fully cooperative arrangement. It's probably not fair to say that it exists because only one state voted for it, but there was major American role of leadership in bringing that about on Monday.
202-783-2727. If you're one of our viewers who lives in the Pacific and Mountain time zones, we have that line set aside for your calls. There are a couple of lines open for you there, and if you dial now, you'll have a chance to ask a question of Secretary Murphy. Let's go next to Houston. You're on the air, caller. Good evening.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Murphy whether he feels that congressional opposition would show Iran that the policy is not fully supported in the States and therefore will tempt them to do something when otherwise they would have not.
All right. Did you hear the first part of the question?
I missed the first part.
Caller, we had a little bit of problem hearing it in the studio. Would you mind asking your first part of your question again?
I just wanted to know whether Mr. Murphy felt that congressional opposition would show Iran that there isn't full support for the policy, for Reagan's policy, and whether that will tempt them to do something because they feel the policy is not fully supported in the United States.
All right, we got it that time. Thank you for your help.
That's fine, and that's a good question, one I welcome. We weren't surprised that there was congressional questioning, congressional doubt, just as we're not surprised that there are questions out there in the American public tonight. I'm particularly happy to have the chance to hear the concerns that are on people's minds. I've testified a number of times to the congressional committees about this reflagging, about our whole policy in the Gulf, and I think that the administration has brought the Congress on board. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't doubts out there in the Congress, and I'm sure in the public at large, about the risks to our people, the risks to our interests. What if we don't stay the course? What if we decide it's too heavy, too onerous, and we pull back? But those risks, we think, are manageable. We think that those risks are measured, and we think that some major American interests are involved. Now, there's no challenge in the Congress about the nature of our interests. Across the board, across the parties, it's recognized there are vital American interests in the Gulf. They found reflagging in some quarters of the Congress, found it peculiar, strange, they didn't understand it. We've given full explanations how it came about, what led to the President's decision. Some are still not persuaded, but as I say, on the overall goals of American policy, I think we have a solid consensus. The other aspect of your question, has this led the Iranians to wonder about our steadfastness, to question whether the President has full support? I'm sure it has. I know that our public statements, our public debates are watched very carefully in Tehran, reported on fully back to that capital. Most of them don't understand the functioning of our political system, and they think that when a protest is raised in Congress, when an editorial is written savaging a policy, that means it doesn't have support. It would be unfortunate if they went from that lack of understanding of our system to assume that there is not steadfastness of purpose on the part of the administration and the Congress. I think there is.
Laguna Beach, California. You're on the air.
Yes, I was wondering two questions. One was, isn't it true that the shipping that's been going through the Straits of Hormuz, for the most part, has gone fairly unmolested over the years? And secondly, isn't it true also that in a 24-mile stretch of open seas there, that if a rowboat couldn't really get through the Straits of Hormuz if the Iranians didn't want them to? Thank you.
Thank you.
You're right on the facts of how much damage has been done to shipping in the Strait. I'd estimate it's probably less than 2% of the ships that have transited the Strait of Hormuz since the tanker war, as it's called, since the tanker war started about 3.5 years ago. Well, the logical question is, so why are we worried? Isn't oil flowing? Yes, oil is flowing, but there were other interests there. Bringing that war to an end and assuring the security of transit and answering the appeal of a friendly state which was being heavily bullied by Iran, as I mentioned ever since last September, led us to conclude that there was more risk in doing nothing than in crafting the policy that we have put into effect, the policy of a peace effort at the United Nations, an effort to control the flow of arms from our friends and allies to Iran, because that's the party that refuses to accept a ceasefire or has refused any mediation to date. And Finally, the reflagging. Reflagging should not be over-dramatized as the major component of our policy. It is but one of, say, 3 elements. And the main one is seeking a peace through the combined weight of the Security Council and international agreements. If Iran does not want, your second question was, if Iran does not want traffic to go through the strait, given the fact it's so narrow, I think, in fact, it's the narrowest part is closer to 50 miles than 24. If you were you referring to the width of the strait itself?
Not there any longer.
No. Anyway, if that was your point, the strait is somewhat wider. It is true that Iran has now in its arsenal a missile called Silkworm, which has a range which could close the strait if they choose to use it to close the strait. And traffic has gone through, yes, in part because Iran didn't stop it. Traffic will continue to go through because of our efforts and the world's interests in keeping that traffic going.
We have a shot of the front page of the Washington Times, which we'll have for our viewers in just a minute, with a color map that shows a bit of the proportion of size of the strait as it leads into the Gulf. While we're getting that set up for you, let's take another telephone call from Tulsa, Oklahoma. You're on the air.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Your question, please.
Yes, I spent 3 years in the Middle East in Dubai, and this was from 77 to 1980, and the Saudis were building a massive pipeline, 2 5-foot diameter pipelines side by side from Abqaiq to Yanbu, and that's more than adequate to pump quite a lot of oil, probably enough to satisfy European needs. Is it really necessary to do this thing? And number 2, are we really prepared to take all the steps necessary to see this thing through? And I guess lastly, do we have the support of the Saudis and UAE and Qatar and Oman in this project?
All right. Thanks for the call.
Is it necessary to undertake the step that we have in reflagging those Kuwaiti tankers? That is a political step that's been taken, in a sense a symbolic step of our determination to keep the traffic flowing freely in the Gulf. You mentioned the pipelines. Yes, there are major pipelines that have been put into operation since you left the region. I was in Saudi Arabia when the oil started to flow. I think it was in 82 or 83 across Saudi Arabia. You're talking about perhaps 2 million barrels a day going through those pipelines. That would not serve by itself the needs of Europe, the needs of Japan, the global needs that the Gulf provides for through pipelines, that the Gulf ships out through its pipelines, and through tankers. Now, do we have the support of the Saudis and the other Gulf states? The answer is yes. You will have read of the Saudi decision to use the AWACS that Saudi Arabia bought from the United States, a sale that was approved, and it was a very controversial sale back in 81. They're using their AWACS now to cover what's called the southern orbit. Southern orbit gives a surveillance picture over the southern Gulf and covering the entire Strait of Hormuz. They are being of assistance, as are the other states, in search and rescue for our Navy personnel should there be another accident, should there be any incidents, providing medical assistance, emergency medical care, readiness to provide that. There's cooperation from the Saudis, from the Kuwaitis, providing free oil for the Navy ships involved in the escort duty, access to the ports. There's a range of assistance depending on the individual state.
We are talking with Assistant Secretary of State Richard Murphy. We have about 25 more minutes to take your telephone questions or comments. Our phone numbers here at C-SPAN will be on the bottom of your screen. Please remember, if you have a question, we have a 30-day policy here at C-SPAN. If you have called our program in the past month, give other people a chance to ask their questions this evening. Let's take our next telephone call. We go to Los Angeles. You're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to know, since the United States has used the United Nations for the passage of the resolution, and that was so successful, wouldn't it be less inflammatory to also use the United Nations to perhaps put a peacekeeping force in the Gulf rather than having all of the risk falling on our country?
Thanks for the call.
Would it be less inflammatory to have a United Nations shipping regime? Conceivably it would be less inflammatory. But remember what's underneath or the root of any regime for shipping in the Gulf. Why is any protection needed? Because there are attacks on those ships. Those ships were being attacked indiscriminately, promiscuously by Iran and Iraq over the past 3.5 years. In Iran's case, they were attacking non-belligerent shipping going in and out of non-belligerent ports. Now, the effort was to deny the income, the economic lifeline of those states, in part, and this would be the Iranian argument, because they wanted to cut off financial aid from those states to Iraq. Now, just because you put a UN flag on those ships doesn't mean that you're going to end the tanker war. That has to be a concerted effort through the Security Council, through the resolution, which was a major achievement and voted last Monday. Just arranging a UN flag would not secure the peace in the Gulf. It's got to be attacked on a number of fronts. We think one of them will have to be an arms embargo on any state, on either of the states that refuses to accept the ceasefire. Secondly, a practical problem, the United Nations has never gotten into a naval regime. These are not easy to, peacekeeping forces are not easy to put together. If you look at the resolution, you'll see it does call for observers to go to the region sent by the United Nations to observe the ceasefire. Now, conceivably, some of them could be shipborne. They're more probably going to be on the land, has been the traditional role of the UN in the Middle East, Egypt, Israel, or between some of the other Arab states and Israel. But you're talking about a very complicated operation of which there simply is no precedent, a UN shipping regime.
Next caller is from Houston. Good evening.
Yes, I have always admired Mr. Murphy's view about the Middle East. My question is, if the regime of Ayatollah decided to launch another land invasion in order to capture the Basra, what your estimate of the possibility if they're going to launch such an offense, and what do you think the Iraqis, are they capable of sustaining that offense? Thank you.
I think the odds are that Iran will attempt another attack on the land against Iraq. In fact, there have been a number of probes of small actions, more or less continuously since the major attack on Basra. But I think you can expect, unless the peacekeeping efforts through the UN are persuasive, if Iran accepts this resolution, then the world will see a great triumph indeed for the diplomacy of the United Nations. But if it doesn't accept that resolution, and Iraq, by the way, just before I came to the studio, I saw a news ticker saying that Iraq welcomed the resolution, was ready to send its foreign minister to New York to discuss arrangements with the Secretary General. I think you could expect to see a further cycle of attacks, and a major attack again is certainly predictable after the summer heat is past. Now, is Iraq capable of sustaining its defenses? Yes, we think so. We think so. It's shown good ability on defense.
Another call from Los Angeles. You're on the air.
Yes, my call is, have we ever considered the thought that we sold arms to Iran, and that some of those arms may be used against the same people who sold arms to them? This Iran-Contra gate is this was involved in selling arms to Iran. Now we're fighting the same. I mean, we're beginning to go against the people who we sold arms to.
Okay, caller, you made your point. Thank you for the question.
Fair question. that was an aberration, that sale to Iran, now fully covered in the congressional hearings and known forever as Irangate. It was a mistake. It was fortunately a limited sale, a limited amount of equipment that changed hands. And I think the weight or the amount of that equipment, by any measure that any military experts' views, will not in time be seen to have affected the course of the war. But I'm very glad that that chapter is ended. It certainly dented our credibility in the region. I think that's largely restored now, and we're back on the policy where most of us thought we always were.
Next call is from Milwaukee. Good evening.
Why haven't the Gulf states given us base rights for our forces?
First of all, because we haven't asked for base rights. Bases in the Middle East are a thing of the past. There's some pretty bitter memories of the colonial days in the Middle East when the British ran this country, the French ran that country, the Italians ran yet another. And there's a high resistance to anything called a base. What we have with several of the Gulf states are understandings about access, particularly to support this operation of escorting the tankers, because we will have a somewhat larger naval presence. I think it's going up from 5 ships to 7 or 8. So there will be need for more port visits, more supplies, etc. But we haven't asked for bases, and it would be foolish to ask for bases. We don't need them, and they won't give them.
On that point, can I ask about this story that appeared in yesterday's Washington Post front page, written by David Ottaway? He writes that a shift in the attitudes among the Gulf states has raised the hopes among U.S. military strategists that the Arab leaders may agree to convert temporary U.S. access to their facilities into more permanent arrangements, possibly including a shore site for the forward headquarters of the U.S. Central Command, now carried aboard a ship.
There may be more permanent arrangements that evolve over time, but I would repeat the point that this is an extremely sensitive issue affecting the sovereignty of the Gulf states. We're not pushing it, that there be more permanent arrangements. The Navy is perfectly capable of carrying out a first-class operation such as the ones engaged in now without different arrangements on the land than it has today.
Okay. Let's go next to Turlock, California. You're on the air for Assistant Secretary Murphy.
Hello, Secretary Murphy. Yes,
Sir.
It seems to me that one threat we have stems from the fact that there are major, Soviet divisions on the borders, the eastern borders of Iran. And what are we prepared to do about something like that, other than just hope that there's no victor in the Iraq-Iran war?
Well, as we're aware, there are major Soviet divisions on the Iranian border. The Iranians are very much aware of that as well, and there's no love feast underway between Moscow and Tehran. It's a very prickly relationship. You're hearing some speeches, some statements these days about our Soviet friends, but that's, I think, a reflex against the concern Iran has about our increased naval activity and our role vis-a-vis the tanker war. There's not much affection between Iran and the Soviet Union. The Soviets moved against Iran after the Second War, as you recall, and it was Truman that told them to get out, and they got out. Whether they have such ambitions again to take territory, or more likely to extend hegemony, extend influence in Iran, I think that's the more likely. The sooner the war can be brought to an end between Iraq and Iran, the better all countries in the region, the better chance all countries in the region will have to assure their own independence, their territorial integrity. And that is one more reason, the Soviet presence and the Soviet push into the region, that we are interested in bringing the war to an end.
Richard Murphy joined the State Department in 1955. He is a native of Boston, Massachusetts. In the past 16 years, he has served as U.S. Ambassador to Mauritania, the Syrian Arab Republic, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia. He was appointed Assistant Secretary of State in 1983. Our next telephone call for him is from St. Louis. You're on the air, caller.
Yes, I'd like to first say that I think that the Iran-Contra hearings has been good for America in the fact that it has exposed the fact that Congress has no business in being in the foreign policy making business. I think it's kind of proved that they just kind of interfere with things and screw everything up. But my question is, if Iran decided to put some mines in the strait there, and let's say one of our ships did hit it, first of all, how would we have to have a guarantee that Iran put them there before we would do anything about it?
Mining in the strait, just as a practical point, mining in the strait is not very likely. The water runs fast and deep in the strait, and Iran's capability at mine laying has not been demonstrated in that type of water. Where Iran put its mines was in the shipping channel to Kuwait at the other end of the Gulf. And they laid a dozen or so mines which our Navy divers working with the Kuwaitis and the Saudis have cleared over the last few days. That operation will continue with basically, I think, a Kuwaiti-Saudi cooperative effort to keep the shipping channel clear of mines. But they have a capability to put mines in the shallower water, in the calmer water of the shipping channels. I wouldn't want to predict just what our reactions would be to an American ship being struck. It would depend on the circumstances, and our Navy is following what's known as peacetime rules of engagement, and those rules of engagement have always provided for the right of self-defense. The ship captain is going to defend his ship and the ship he's escorting from either hostile intent or hostile action.
Our next caller is from California. Help me out with the name of your town, caller.
Tulare.
Tulare.
L-A-R-E.
All right, glad to have you. What's your question, please?
I'd like to know about this reflagging. If it's so good, why don't we let the Japanese bring a few of their destroyers over and we reflag them and let them escort a few of the tankers since they're getting the oil? And why are we so anxious to protect them? You know, they're selling our secrets to the Russians for money. And then another thing, what if some of our planes go in to take out those silkworm missiles and a few of the Hawks come up to get them? What do we do? You know, Hawk missiles we sold to them.
All right. Thank you for the questions. Appreciate it.
Well, specific point on Japan is that under their constitution, which we had a strong influence on its adoption, was that they would not operate their Navy outside of the first Japanese territorial waters, now a bit broader than the territorial waters, but they have no Navy ready to operate beyond and certainly as far afield as the Persian Gulf. Why, more to the point though, your question, why are we anxious to protect Japan, let them do it? Well, I say constitutionally they can't do it with their own Navy. But why are we anxious? Because of the way the oil market works. It is true that we take a relatively small percentage of our oil from the Gulf. America today takes probably no more than 15% of its oil imports from the Gulf. All right, that's 1987. 1997 or even earlier, we're going to be taking probably twice that percentage of our imports from the Gulf. So our stake is there and our stake is growing. But even today, with that small stake, if oil prices go up because of a major incident or major activity in a critical area like the Gulf, and the producers, the shippers panic and the consumers are ready to pay, if they get nervous, the whole world is affected, including the American consumer. And you'll remember the gas lines of 73, of 79 again, when the price went up marginally on a very small percentage of our imports, there was an instant effect. Even though it was a small percentage affected, a marginal amount of oil, the prices of all oil went up, and we paid heavily for that. Again, I can't get into discussions of what if in military terms. I just make this observation about the Hawk anti-aircraft missile. This was in the Shah's inventory before the Iranian Revolution. A number of missiles were sold off to the Khomeini government, not a significant number. But it's a good weapon, and yours is a good question.
Roswell, Georgia, you're on the air for the Secretary.
Secretary Murphy, you're one of the few people out there get up down there that have any backbone or have good sense. I watch you on the TV all the time. And half of them that's on the TV from the State Department and all, they don't make the same sense that you do. Anyway, what I wanted to say, I want to ask you about your attitude about other nations in the area there. I know one reason that Congress hesitated on the reflagging, and they won't say this on the TV, was because of pressure from Israel's lobby. And the reason they're pressuring on them because they don't want the United States to get in any military deal with the Kuwaitis or the Saudis, any kind of cooperation, you understand, because then we might sell them some more weapons or something like that. And we might find out they ain't the devil themselves. And what I'd like to know is I think they'd rather keep the arms going to Iran like they've been doing for years themselves, and then let Iran take over the Kuwaitis and take over the Saudis and everybody else, and then, then they end up take over the Iraqis and everything, and then they probably end up wiping out Iran and taking over all that territory.
Okay, I'm going to stop you at that point and let the Secretary respond. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the compliments, ma'am. I always like a commercial. I'm not sure I agree with you, though, on the point that Congress was reluctant to see us reflag because of how this would affect the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I have made the point in some of my own testimony, and the other administration spokesmen have as well, that we've got vital interests in the Gulf. We have vital interests in the Arab-Israeli confrontation, but these are two fundamentally separate sets of problems. And we do American interests a disservice if we blur them. I don't think many in Congress who were doubtful about reflagging, hesitant, critical, what you want to call it, were so because of Israeli lobbying. I really don't agree with that point. In Israel itself, there has been a shift of opinion about Iran. Kind of interesting shift. You can trace it in the Israeli press, in the sort of public debate that goes on in that country. While Iraq used to be seen as the biggest, toughest potential enemy of Israel, and they cultivated a good relationship with the Shah, and that effort obviously continued after the Shah's departure because, well, you've heard some of the things said during the congressional hearings. There is a shift of opinion in Israel to recognize that the ideals of the Iranian Revolution are probably the most determinedly anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli, particularly anti-Israeli, of any movement or any political leadership operating today in the world. That lesson has been learned very painfully, and it's required some rethinking in Israel, but that rethinking is going on. And you don't have the same attitude as used to prevail.
A note on issues closer to home. The National Governors Association will be holding its annual meeting this weekend. Traverse City, Michigan, C-SPAN cameras will be there, as we have in the past few years, to carry that meeting live to you. The governor's theme this year is Making America Work Again. They'll be spending a few days talking about welfare reform and its effect on the states. Let's go next for a question on U.S. Mideast policy to Seattle, Washington. You're on the air, caller.
Yes, good afternoon, Secretary Murphy.
Afternoon.
I have sort of three questions that I wonder if you could answer. And as we all know, we are having problems with the dollar and with world market and trade. And I know the theory of the balance of power, but why in the world can't Europe and Japan at least pay for our arms and our help and our men? I mean, if they don't have theirs there, and we're doing the job for them, I don't see why they can't chip in and pay. Now, my second question. Eisenhower formed NATO. I don't think he ever meant it to be an ongoing, continuous thing in which we send weapons, men, and ammunition and everything to Europe. Besides which, they all don't like it, they fuss, they fume, and let's face it, it costs us about $525 million or billion that we could have defraying our own national debt. Now, why don't we allow them to use their own arms, weapons, and men, or else pay for ours? You get to the point where you want to help those that need help, but you get awfully tired of bearing the brunt, and this nation has borne the brunt of the world's problem.
Okay, caller, I'm going to hold you at that point. Thanks for those two questions. We're running out of time.
In fact, Europe is helping to pay for the effort in the Gulf through sharing. I mentioned earlier the British and the French warships which are in the Gulf. So we're not doing a solo act there. And we're not doing anything just for the color of somebody else's eyes. Our economy would be very drastically, basically affected by a surge in oil prices, which could result from a crisis in the Gulf. So it's our interests we're serving, as well as the interests of other consumer nations. Now, I'm not sure you really want us to go with a tin cup in hand, asking the Japanese, asking the Europeans to pay for the U.S. Navy, to pay for the salaries, whatever, share the costs of our fighting men operating in the Gulf. They are serving an American vital interest. We have a leadership role inherent in our position in the world, and I don't think it's becoming to us to go out and, so to speak, solicit funds for the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force. What we have asked is that nations contribute in various ways to bringing this war to an end. Japan has had a diplomatic effort going for several years trying to bring a mediation about between Tehran and Baghdad, between Iraq and Iran. Just after the Venice summit, where President Reagan attended with the other major leaders of the West, just after that summit, the Japanese foreign minister went back to the region and again tried to reinvigorate, restart that diplomatic initiative. So each in his own way is trying to do something, and as the UN called the other day, they call for an international reconstruction effort. Well, you can be darn sure that if that war is brought to an end, countries are going to be looking to powerful economies like the Japanese, like the German, to make substantial contributions to reconstruction. On NATO,
Secretary Murphy, I'm going to hold you on the NATO question. We're almost out of time and we have a caller on the line, so let's take one last call.
Sure.
Tampa, Florida, your question, please.
Yes, I was wanting to know, it seems to me that there's a disproportionate number of pro-Israel heads in our State Department, and I was wondering if we had the same amount of Arabs there, would it be fair, and who makes the final decisions on the Middle East?
All right, thank you. We have 1 minute left, Mr. Secretary.
Well, the final decisions on the Middle East are made by the President as the chief decision maker on our foreign policy. And every effort is made to have a balanced foreign policy that will serve our interests in the region as globally. But the final decision maker, we all work for the President in the administration, our experts, our assistant secretaries, our Secretary of State work for the President.
I'm told by our producer if you'd like to tackle the NATO question, they can give us another minute.
1 more minute for NATO. Just the observation, not a direct answer to the earlier question, but out of the NATO area, outside of the NATO area, it's always been extremely difficult to organize any military operations, any truly coordinated operations, as is the style within NATO. So you're not seeing that tighter coordination in the Gulf. You're seeing cooperation between the French, the Americans, and the British, but it's nothing smacking of the sort of coordination that we have in Europe.
Thanks to all our viewers for participating this evening, and a special thanks to our guest, Assistant Secretary of State Richard Murphy, in our studios in Washington to explain administration policy towards the Middle East.
People should write in and get that pamphlet we just published this week.
And I don't know if we can see it on screen. Let me see if I can hold this up here. U.S. policy in the Persian Gulf. And how do you get a copy of this?
Right into the Bureau of Public Affairs, Department of State, Washington, D.C. It's a pretty good survey of just what the policy is today, what we're trying to do.
Thanks again for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks again for your questions and comments. You have a good evening.
To contact our guest, you may write to the Department of State, 2201 C Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20520.